So we've had a lot of changes in college admissions this past year. 2024 has been interesting. So today we're going to talk about the testing landscape, how it's evolved since COVID, and we'll touch on how applications are increasing, particularly at highly selective colleges. And we'll touch base briefly on artificial intelligence and how it's being used in college admission. And then finally, very briefly, we'll talk about the Supreme Court decision on race-based admission and how, that might be affecting college applicants. So what I'd like to do first is provide some context to this whole discussion of testing. So in 2020, prior to 2020 in the pandemic, many colleges were test optional. There were many, I would say, moderately selective colleges, as well as some very selective colleges, such as University of Chicago and Bowdoin, that were test optional, prior to COVID. And then, COVID hit, and that fall, there were plenty of students that could take a test, and those tended to be students that are good test takers. They didn't have to prep much, or they prepped fairly early and were able to get a high score. So I would say a significant number of high school juniors, especially if they're taking the SAT, take their first test in March. And of course, everything was shut down then. So what happened as a result is the middle 50%, or the median scores for SAT and ACT, rose because only, those very strong test takers were able to get tests. And so what happened with that is that set the bar for subsequent application years. So, you know, applicants found themselves in a situation of being told, like, oh, you have a 33 on the SAT, and you shouldn't submit that because our mid-range is 34 to 36, which now seems really crazy because a 33 is a very good score. But that was what was happening to applicants back then. So we're going to get into that a little bit more, but other changes to the SAT and ACT is, first, the SAT is now a digital test, as you may have heard. It's also adaptive, so depending on how students do on the first few questions, they're then tracked into harder questions or easier questions, and depending on which way they're tracked, like there'll be a maximum or a minimum of possible first score. Many students who took the March SAT did report that the math was extraordinarily difficult and wasn't math they had seen in any of their digital practice tests. So I think that they're still trying to figure it out and work it out, and I'm sure we'll see more revisions to that digital test in the coming months. As far as the ACT goes, they're offering both a digital and paper test, but most of the test centers, at least in the greater Boston area, as far as I know, are still using the paper test. But there are other parts of the country that are using digital. They have not changed the test otherwise. It's the same length. It has the same long passages, whereas the SAT has shortened their reading passages and the overall test is shorter. And then we've seen, and I'm sure you've seen in the news, that there is a return to test requirements, and we're particularly seeing that among many highly selective colleges. So if you look at this chart, you can see in the first column, it says, undecided, meaning they hadn't yet set a formal policy for how they were going to handle applicants for the coming year. Some of these colleges are just merely not going to make an announcement. They're just going to keep the status quo. I would look for some of those colleges in column one to perhaps go back to requiring testing after next year, but we'll wait and see what will happen. The second column, where it says extended to 2024, 2025. So for at least the coming application season, these colleges will continue to be test optional. Many of them have not pledged beyond that year, so we'll be keeping our eye on that as well. And then in the top of the third column, you see those that have returned to requiring testing this year. And most of these schools are selective schools, and some of them are by state legislature. So for example, Georgia and Tennessee. You'll notice an asterisk next to Yale, and the reason for that is because Yale has a policy where they will allow students to do a variety of submissions, such as AP exams. So they're a little different. And then finally, test blind, schools that are test blind include the California Public. So that means they don't look at tests at all. Like if you're even able to submit them, they won't be considered, but I don't even think you're able to submit them with their applications. And just noting, WPI is Worcester Polytechnic Institute, Stonehill College is a regional college in Massachusetts, and University of San Diego it's not UC San Diego, that's the private Jesuit Catholic school. So this murky world of test reporting and the decision, of whether a student should submit their score or not, um, it really is in the hands of the admissions office, and it's not always clear to the student, especially if their scores are, close, but not, right under the middle 50%. So just to clarify, colleges usually report their schools that like the 25th to 75th percentile of admitted students. So traditionally, the conventional wisdom has been, if you're in that range, submit your scores. Sometimes selective schools, people would say, if you're not at the 50th, don't submit your scores. So, again, that's starting to change, and I'm going to explain that a little bit more in a minute. The other thing to know is that tests are reviewed in context of the student in their high school, and they can vary among applicants to the same college. So if you have one applicant that's applying from an affluent, public high school where 98% of the students go to college and their average test scores are generally, pretty high, that's going to be viewed differently than a student that attends a low resource school, perhaps in a low income community, and that student maybe gets the highest standardized test score ever seen in their high school, but it might still be quite a bit lower than that suburban student. Well, they're not going to expect that student to have those higher scores because they're understanding that student in the context of their own experience. Same thing would apply to like students who English isn't their first language and other things like that. In the choice to not report a score, it definitely does say something about the student, but it's not going to be clear to the applicant what it does say to the college about them. That will remain a mystery. And then it's important to know that colleges can and are starting to impute scores by considering what available data they have about the applicant, such as where they go to school, the kinds of courses they take, and that sort of thing. So as a result, it's changing the advice about whether you should submit your scores or not. So first off, there have been in recent years some students that have elected not to take the test at all because there were so many test optional schools. My advice is to take a test. Even if you don't feel you're a great test taker, do some practicing. You don't have to take it a million times, but take the test, because if you apply to a school that requires a score, they might do a holistic review and they may not put a ton of weight on the score. But if you need to have one for that school, then you're going to regret that you didn't take the test. So I think, unless there's an extraordinary reason, most students should plan to take a standardized test. Again, I alluded to this a minute ago, but the previous advice about only submitting if you're in the middle 50% of accepted students has changed. So I think it's going to, again, be school by school. There are going to be some schools that are not going to want to see the score if you're not in the middle 50, but I think more of them, if you're very close, would like to see the score. So that's another change. And studying for standardized tests, like even if you don't feel like your score is going to be high, there is value in that, because students do improve their math skills in particular, I believe, and that almost serves as a remediation or a reminder as they go on to higher level math. So there is some benefit to it. And I'm not necessarily pro test. I mean, I really like test optional, but I think we have to deal with the reality of what's happening out there. So now let's talk about increasing applications. So the common application is the application that is used by most high school students and transfer students applying to college. It's used now by over 1,000 colleges and universities. And the applicants that used it increased by 6% this year. So it has this pretty steady increase each year. Each of those, applicants on average applied to more schools this past year. And, colleges, in particular, colleges that announced, significant increases in their financial aid saw big increases. So Duke is an example. The state of Minnesota has offered more generous financial aid policies. Two-year colleges have also seen a boost in applications, and partly that's because of the dialogue we're hearing about people questioning the value of a four-year college education, particularly because of its expense. And people are really starting to push back, especially now that we're starting to see institutions that are charging $90,000 a year, even though most students will not pay that price. Often those are schools that only give need-based financial aid. So if a family maybe doesn't quite qualify for need-based aid, but maybe they don't necessarily have the money to pay 90,000 a year, people are really questioning the cost of college. The filing of the financial aid application, otherwise known as FAFSA, as you may know, there was a lot of news coverage. It was redesigned this year, and there were a lot of problems with it. So the filing of that is down by 40%, which is huge, and that's as of this month. And so, students are supposed to be making decisions about where they're going to enroll in college, the current senior class, by May 1st. Many colleges have extended it out. And some of them don't even have an accurate financial aid package yet from their schools. So there are also a lot of mistakes. So this could potentially wreak havoc on four-year colleges come fall if students don't end up showing up because they didn't get their aid package and they decide to just wait a year. So with colleges, particularly less selective colleges having financial issues, that could be a real problem for higher education. And then finally, acceptance rates at highly selective colleges continue to decrease. They're really low now, so it's like I don't know. I don't know if they're going to get into negative numbers at some point and throw a few people out. um, so this is just a sampling of schools. So, I already mentioned Duke has their financial aid policy, but you can see blue is the 2023 cycle and orange is the 2024 cycle. So you can see, there's been, quite an increase. UPenn had a particularly big increase. USC and, Los Angeles slightly less so. And just to give you a sense of the highly selective colleges, their admit rate, you can see that their, Duke's decreased. Again, this was related to increased applications, but across the board, I would say, with the exception on this chart of Harvard and Northwestern, everybody else, their admit rate was lower. Harvard got fewer applications. I mean, obviously, it's still an incredibly selective school, but most people attribute it to the turmoil on campus because of Hamas-Israel war and the former president testifying before Congress, and there was a lot of attention on Harvard and not all of it positive. So I'm not really sure about Northwestern. I'm not sure what the reason would be that their applications went somewhat down. And then, early decision. So for those of you who are not as familiar with the terminology, early decision is when a student applies early, usually by November 1st. They typically get an admissions decision around the holidays, and or a little before of their senior year. And if they do get into the school, they're bound to attend. They sign an agreement that if they get in, they will attend. REA is restricted early action, and that's a little different. That's when, and it tends to be like schools like Stanford, Princeton, Harvard have this plan. And this is when you do apply early. You're only allowed to apply early to one school. You can apply to public schools early action, but you're only allowed to apply to a private school one. And you find out you get in early, but you're not bound to attend. You're still free to apply to other schools in the regular decision round. So, and then there's early action, which is, you apply early, you can apply to as many early action schools as you want. You find out early, sometimes not till January, and you're not bound to attend. So there's all this terminology. Um, so you can see here that, the admission rate went down everywhere except Harvard, which is still, very, very selective. And, so we're continuing to see these applications go up, the application admit rates going down. Um, and I don't want this presentation to make it seem like I'm only talking about the most selective schools that really educate very few people, but I wanted to explain it because there is a trickle down effect. So that's the reason I'm starting with that. So, here, this is a nice visual chart. Like you can see, for example, let's just look at Cornell. Back with the class of 1996, they were admitting, say, 6,300 or some odd students, and with class of 2026, which is just 2 years ago, they're admitting like just over 5. So that's quite a steep decline. So why? Like, why is this happening? So yes, it's because applications are up, but this is like a funnel of like how the admissions office works. So, it starts with like, people inquiring, applicants, then, applicants that actually have completed their file and sent all their transcripts. Then they admit students, then people deposit. And then finally, they enroll a class, the matriculants, the people who show up in August or September. So yield is a term you may have heard, but yield is what is the percent of students that accept the offer of admission? So in other words, what percent become matriculants? So part of the reason for the declining admission rates is, more and more students accepted the offer of admission. And so, when that happened, that was also impacted by the early plans. So for example, I think it was like 2006, Harvard said they made an announcement they were getting rid of their early plan because they said it's not fair to low income students, because low income students need to compare financial aid offers. And even though Harvard is very generous, it's probably become more generous since that time, that it isn't fair to them. So like Princeton followed, and not everybody followed, but a few other schools did. But what happened is they didn't lock in enough of the class early. So when students could, apply to more schools and they didn't kind of have to pick one, they the Harvards and the Princetons of the world found that their yield wasn't as good. And they care about yield because yield um affects rankings, and they all care about rankings, which seems surprising that, the Harvards and Princetons of the world, why would they care? They have a great reputation, they get so many applicants, but they do. I guess they like to reserve bragging rights to say like they want to be the most selective college in the country, and they're all vying for that status. So what happens from there is this then starts to impact. So you have these incredibly strong students with like their A's and their great test scores and interesting activities, but only about 3 or 4% of them are going to get into these really top schools, which isn't very many. So then, of course, they'll keep applying to other schools because they want a balanced list. So this is just a little snapshot just to give you a sense of what's happened like in the last several years. So I'm going to highlight a couple that I think are really interesting. So if you look at Colgate, you can see that back in the 2020 cycle, they had 9,951 applicants. This was big news at the time. The next year they doubled. So they were up to 17,533. And at the time, the enrollment management and admissions office at Colgate didn't have any idea why. Like they didn't really feel like they had done a lot different with their admission outreach. So it was just one of those fluky things. So that is completely unpredictable if you were applying to Colgate that year. UC Boulder, or I guess a lot of people call it CU Boulder, but that's University of Colorado Boulder. You can see that they went from last year, 42,378 applicants, to 68,000 this year. Some people call it the Deion Sanders effect. So Deion Sanders is a former Patriots player, and he's now the head football coach. But who knows, right? It could be anything. But my guess is that's probably a pretty good theory. Boston College is another interesting example. If you go back to 2020, so they had 29,400 applicants. That year, they decided to add early decision. So that's the binding one. That prior to that, they had early action, which is where you apply, they let you know, but you're not bound to attend. So the next year, their applications really skyrocketed to 39,875. And my guess is that a lot of people who had done well under early action, there are a lot of legacies that live in Greater Boston, found that they maybe were shut out and they didn't do as well. So a lot of people got on board and just started applying early decision to BC, and all the buzz around that contributed to its increased application numbers. The Tulane is a really fascinating case study that relates back to what I was saying earlier about yield. So one of the things that happens with yield is that you might hear of stories where like somebody will say, well, my next door neighbor was, a straight A student in really rigorous classes and had great test scores, and they got, deferred at University of Miami, they got denied at Tulane, or whatever the case may be. And it seems really illogical, even though Tulane and Miami are very competitive schools. So what Tulane did, as you can see back in 2020, they had 42,000 plus applicants, went up a little bit in 2021, stayed about the same in 2022. But around that time, people started to get frustrated with Tulane because they were tired of having their really strong students not get in or get deferred, or they were tired. When I say people, I'm meaning people like myself, school counselors, the students getting letters saying like, you applied early action, but we want you to convert to early decision if you really want a good chance of getting in here. So there was a lot of manipulating of the applicant pool, in order to look more selective. And they were admitting, 2/3 of the class or more through early decision. So if you were applying regular decision or early action, your chances weren't very good. So I think that that's partly why in 2023 their applications dropped so much. And then I think they changed their policies for this year, because this year, for the first time, we began to see a much more reasonable approach where students that should be getting in are getting in. So my guess is that the applications will go up again next year, and that hopefully they'll continue their more positive admissions policies. So I think what is the advice then about college lists? So I definitely don't want this to seem like doom and gloom, because there are so many great colleges out there, and students that are good students are going to have amazing choices. So it's all about having a good balanced list. So first, being realistic. So sometimes, students will say, well, I have a 3.5, but I'm going to apply to Stanford anyway because you never know. And, yeah, okay, you never know, but I think you kind of do know. So I think that if somebody wants to do that and have a little fun with one school, I think that's fine. But you wouldn't want a student to be putting all their time and energy into all these applications that are really, not in line with their academic profile, so that they're running out of steam on the applications that are actually a target and are appropriate for them. So being realistic doesn't mean you don't aspire, but being realistic is really important. Second, as I mentioned, having a balanced list. So sure, aspire to some schools, but then make sure you have some schools that are in target with your academic profile, and some that are feeling more likely. The word safety is kind of a dated word that isn't really used anymore because of all these practices that colleges use to enroll a class. It's become much more difficult to predict. But we generally can feel good about certain schools on the list, about a student's chances. So you want to make sure, and you want to like those schools. So if you visit a school that you think you'll probably get into, but you don't really like it, well, our work isn't done. You want to find some schools that you can feel really excited about attending. And then it's important to be strategic about where you apply early decision. First of all, not everyone wants to apply early decision, and that's fine, or restricted early action. But you want to be thoughtful about it. Again, you don't want to use it for a school that is pretty out of reach for you, where you might have another school that is also a tad out of reach. But if you use your early decision there, you may well get in. And if you don't use it there, then you're in the regular applicant pool where it's much tougher. So, and we obviously guide our students, and we don't make the decision for them, but we help them really understand this thoroughly. And, know that a college does not define your life. You do. I think that a lot of the, focus on the most selective schools has been a lot about fear, like, parents fear that economically their children may not do as well as they have. This is what we're hearing, and they feel like certain schools are a ticket to a better life. But interestingly, in this era of startups, in tech, and AI is taking off. A lot of the jobs are not necessarily going to students that attend these most selective schools. I think there are still like certain fields like Wall Street and things like consulting really like students from these most selective schools, but there's a lot of students that make, if income is what matters, let make like very high salaries, that didn't necessarily go to these schools because they're in these like this new tech world. So again, what you get out of it, what you put into it. So AI in college admissions. So they definitely did use it this past cycle, and more colleges plan to use it. But I would say it's mostly used for kind of rote things, not for any, really important decisions. So, for example, colleges have run transcripts doing a keyword search to get like a threshold for, is this student's GPA test scores and like their course rigor in line with like a successful applicant. So it's kind of like a first pass that they might use it for. Um, University of Pennsylvania and Colorado Boulder have done a pilot to use AI to see if they can assess personal qualities, in essays and other things. They're not necessarily using that as a permanent policy, but it's something that they've piloted. And then if colleges are using AI to, screeners to see if the student used AI to draft the essay. And those tools are not 100% foolproof, but it's really important to make sure your kids don't use AI to draft their essay. If they want to use it to, do a little research on a college, although they have to make sure it's factual, because some of the like Chat GPT is a couple of years old, and sometimes they can give you wrong information. So, the student is really just better off writing it themselves. But there might be, times where they could use it for an outline, but not using any of the language. We steer our clients away from using it at all. But we have to live in the real world with what students. So it is important to have a conversation with your children about that. But overall, it is still very much a human process. We're not at the point where AI is going to make a decision on a college application, and I hope we never get to that point. But there are concerns, right? So, we're going to all be keeping our eye on this. So, currently there's a little bit of a lack of transparency. Like the colleges aren't really explaining. Some are, but most of them aren't really talking about how they're using it. The National Association for College Admissions Counseling is what admissions folks are in, people like myself, school counselors. It's a professional association where all things admission get discussed. And as of yet, there have been no guidelines from them. I don't know if there are any in the works. And then, there is the risk of ethical problems and bias. So, machine learning, simulates patterns, looks for patterns. And, is it possible that, it could, if it was used too widely, it would just replicate like the same looking classes of the past, and that could present problems for society. So we're not there yet. We don't need to worry. There's nothing you need to do, but we just need to be aware of it and keep our eye on it. Okay, so the decision on race-based admission. So when I put out the outline for this, I was hoping that the colleges would report their demographic information. We would have more to say. but most of them just have decided not to release that until this summer. I think it's going to be very sensitive because, particularly like Harvard and UNC were the targets of the lawsuit. They're going to be scrutinized, as will other peer institutions. So, the pundits, those who seem to be in the know, predict that there'll be decreases in the number of Black and Hispanic students and an increase in the number of Asian students at these schools, but we don't really know yet, so we'll wait and see. Colleges, the thing I've been noticing lately is colleges are also converting. So if they had scholarships in the past that, were named for a Black leader and were intended for Black students, they can't do that anymore. So they're changing those to be, either about first gen or low income, or, they're just changing the parameters. And, colleges have done more outreach to community-based organizations this year to new ways to bring new students that are strong students into the applicant pool without going against the Supreme Court decision. So if you have questions, this would be a great time to put them in the chat. If you, want to learn more about how we assist students in navigating the college admissions process, by email is jcasey@educationaladvocates.com. We have an inquiry template on our website with the addresses there if you want to reach out, or if you want to snap a photo of my introductory meeting link. Actually, I can probably put that in the chat as well.